All right, so today we're going to be taking a deep dive into international affairs.
Okay.
Specifically, we're going to be looking at some of President Trump's recent actions and statements.
Right, sounds good.
The stuff that you guys sent in has been pretty wild.
Yeah.
From Trump talking about owning Gaza to the continuing war in Ukraine.
Right.
And then an attempted hit on Putin's death squad chief.
Yeah, that sounds like something out of a movie.
It does sound like a movie.
Yeah.
So we're going to be breaking down each of these and see what we can learn about the current situation.
Okay, so what really jumps out at me is how these situations show the difficulties that President Trump is facing in international affairs.
Yeah.
I mean, his approach is very, let's just say, unique.
Yeah, his style is definitely unique.
Right.
So let's just start with the whole Gaza situation.
Okay.
I mean, owning a territory,
Yeah.
that's not exactly what you typically hear in diplomatic language.
No, it's certainly not standard procedure. And to really understand what this all means,
Right.
I think it's important to keep in mind that we're dealing with a region that's full of history and really sensitive political dynamics,
Yeah,
you know?
absolutely. And we actually have audio of Trump saying this.
Okay.
Let's take a listen.
All right.
Wow.
Wow.
He's talking about taking ownership.
Yeah.
Redeveloping, creating jobs.
Uh-huh.
It's a bold idea.
Definitely ambitious.
Yeah, ambitious is a good word for it.
But whether or not something like that could actually be done,
Right.
that's another question entirely.
Yeah.
I mean, legally speaking,
Yeah.
one country just claiming ownership of another country's territory, there's no precedent for that.
Yeah.
And how would the people living in Gaza react to that?
Right.
I mean, they've been through decades of conflict and displacement.
Yeah.
I don't think they'd be too happy about it.
No, probably not. And it's interesting that he even uses the phrase resettle people. It almost sounds like he's thinking about some kind of mass relocation, which is pretty problematic.
It raises some serious red flags.
Yeah.
And this seems to be like a recurring theme in Trump's approach to international affairs.
Yeah.
It's these big pronouncements,
Right.
these sweeping statements,
Yeah.
instead of focusing on the details of diplomacy and really understanding the complexities of what's happening on the ground.
Yeah. It's all about making a big splash.
Right.
But what about the ripple effects? And remember Netanyahu was standing right there
Oh, yeah.
when Trump said all this? He did not look happy.
No, he really didn't.
He looked like a deer in the headlights.
It's like he was caught completely off guard.
Yeah, even if Trump had told him beforehand, like his press secretary later claimed, Netanyahu was clearly not expecting that announcement.
No, he wasn't.
It almost felt like Trump was trying to pressure Netanyahu.
Yeah.
Like he was saying, you couldn't solve the Gaza problem, so I'm stepping in.
Right. That's a very plausible interpretation.
Yeah.
I mean, Trump seems to love playing the role of the ultimate deal maker.
Yeah.
The guy who comes in and fixes everything.
Right.
But in this case,
Yeah.
his solution feels more like a power play than a genuine attempt to address the actual issue.
Right, and the potential consequences are huge.
Yeah.
This isn't just some real estate deal.
No, it's not.
What would this mean for U.S.-Israeli relations?
Right.
What about the Palestinian people
Uh-huh.
and the entire Middle East?
It's a very delicate situation.
Yeah, the stakes are really high.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And some people might say that Trump is just trying to be provocative, you know, shake things up, force everyone to the negotiating table.
Yeah.
But these kinds of pronouncements without a clear plan or a deep understanding of the potential fallout
Yeah.
can be incredibly dangerous. It could erode trust
Right.
and make tensions even worse.
Absolutely. Now, to make things even more interesting, a former intelligence officer named Scott Ritter had some really strong opinions about this whole Gaza situation.
Okay.
He says that Trump's plan isn't just impractical and immoral. He goes so far as to call it unlawful and unconstitutional.
Wow.
He even suggests that Trump could be labeled a war criminal if he actually tries to go through with this.
Okay.
Those are some serious accusations.
Yeah, they are. And I think Ritter's perspective is definitely worth considering.
Yeah.
He raises the very real possibility of extreme violence and suffering if the U.S. were to try to forcibly remove Palestinians from Gaza.
Right.
We're talking about people who have fiercely resisted displacement for generations.
Yeah.
They're not just going to pack up and leave because Donald Trump says so.
Yeah. And he makes another interesting point. Trump's plan completely ignores Hamas. Ritter argues that the best course of action would be to negotiate with Hamas directly, to recognize them as a legitimate political force.
Okay.
Which is obviously a very different approach
Yeah.
than what we're seeing from the current administration.
Right. And this brings up a much bigger question.
Yeah.
How do we define and engage with those we consider our adversaries? Can we break free from this cycle of demonization and force?
Right.
And instead try to find solutions through dialogue,
Yeah.
even if it means talking to people we don't like?
Right. That's a huge question.
It is.
It really makes you think about how we approach these complex global challenges.
Yeah.
But before we go too far down that path,
Okay.
let's switch gears and talk about the other major issue you sent us,
Right.
the war in Ukraine.
Yeah. Let's take a look at that.
Okay.
That situation is just as full of uncertainty and potential danger.
Absolutely. And it seems like Trump's approach to this conflict
Yeah.
is also marked by these bold claims that don't really line up with what's happening on the ground.
Okay.
For example, he's repeatedly claimed unbelievably high Russian casualty figures, even saying that 1 million Russian soldiers have been killed.
Wow.
He's also made statements about the Russian economy being on the verge of collapse, even saying things like, I'm going to do Russia a favor. Their economy is failing.
Okay. I gotta say, those claims are, to put it bluntly, wildly inaccurate.
Yeah.
We have to be really careful about taking information at face value,
Right.
especially when it comes from sources that have a vested interest in shaping the narrative.
Right. Now, Ritter, who we mentioned earlier,
Yeah.
has a very different view of the situation in Ukraine.
Okay.
He argues that Russia is actually winning, and decisively so. He points to the fact that Russia has been preparing for a long conflict,
Okay.
both economically and militarily,
Right.
and that they're not going to back down easily.
Okay. That's a pretty sobering assessment.
Yeah.
It's crucial to consider different perspectives and not fall into the trap of wishful thinking.
Right.
The reality is that this war is probably going to continue, and the consequences are going to be significant for everyone involved.
Absolutely. And here's another concerning point.
Okay.
Despite Trump's talk about stopping aid to Ukraine, it seems like the flow of military aid is still going on. He's even authorized the transfer of Patriot missile batteries from Israel to Ukraine.
Wow.
Which comes with a hefty price tag.
Yeah. It is troubling to see this inconsistency between what's being said and what's actually being done.
Yeah.
It suggests that even while publicly saying he wants to end the war, the U.S. might be actively contributing to it continuing, which could prolong the difficulties faced by the people of Ukraine.
Right. It's a complicated and unsettling situation that makes you question the effectiveness and ethical implications of U.S. foreign policy.
Indeed. We need to be critical of the narratives we're given. Think about the motives of those in power.
Right.
And demand more transparency and accountability from our leaders.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've got Trump making these outlandish claims about owning Gaza.
Yeah.
A war in Ukraine that's dragging on despite what he says. And a lot of unanswered questions about why he's doing what he's doing and what the consequences might be. It's a lot to take in.
It certainly is. But it's important to dig into these issues, challenge what we think we know, and try to really understand what's happening in the world.
Absolutely. We can't just sit back and watch.
Right.
We need to be aware and involved in shaping the world we want to live in.
I couldn't agree more. Just being passive and indifferent isn't going to get us anywhere.
No.
We need to be actively involved in creating the world we want to see.
Exactly.
Oh, and before we move on, there's another important point Ritter makes that I think we should talk about. He warns about the danger of believing your own propaganda, especially when you're dealing with complex international issues like the war in Ukraine.
Right.
It seems like Trump has surrounded himself with people who just tell him what he wants to hear.
Yeah.
Instead of giving him the reality of the situation.
It's like that old story about the emperor with no clothes.
Right.
Nobody wants to tell him the truth.
Exactly. And Ritter highlights how this can have real-world consequences. Trump's insistence on portraying Russia as weak and on the verge of collapse could actually be harmful to U.S. interests. His attempts to cripple the Russian economy through sanctions and manipulating oil prices might backfire and even end up hurting the American economy.
It sounds like he's playing a high-stakes game without understanding the rules or even knowing what cards he's holding.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And the saddest part is that it's the ordinary people who end up paying the price for these kinds of miscalculations,
That's
not the politicians or the pundits.
You're right. And speaking of paying the price,
Yeah.
Ritter doesn't paint a very optimistic picture of the situation in Ukraine. He says the Ukrainian people are being given false hope of victory while being supplied with weapons that ultimately won't change the outcome of the war.
That's a tough one.
Yeah.
So are we really helping the people of Ukraine by prolonging a conflict they can't win?
Right.
Or are we just using them as pawns in some larger geopolitical game?
It's a difficult question.
It is.
And I don't think there's an easy answer.
No.
That's definitely something we need to consider as we watch this conflict unfold. It all comes back to the question of leadership and accountability.
Right.
We need leaders who are willing to face reality
Yeah.
even when it's uncomfortable, and who prioritize the well-being of the people they represent
Right.
over their own political ambitions.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've discussed Trump's perplexing Gaza proposal, the disconnect between his rhetoric and reality in Ukraine, and the danger of leaders believing their own propaganda.
Yeah.
Was there anything else Ritter highlighted about these situations?
Yes. Actually, there's one more point I think is particularly important.
Okay.
Ritter compares Trump's actions to those of Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense during the Vietnam War.
Okay.
McNamara, much like Trump, clung to false narratives about how the war was progressing,
Right.
ignoring evidence that contradicted his desired outcome.
Yeah.
This ultimately prolonged the conflict, leading to unnecessary losses.
That's a pretty disturbing parallel.
It is.
It makes you wonder if we're doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past.
It's a sobering thought for sure.
Yeah.
But recognizing these patterns
Right.
and understanding the dangers of unchecked power and self-deception can help us chart a different course.
So let's recap. We've got a potential international crisis brewing in Gaza, a war in Ukraine that's spiraling out of control,
Right.
and a president who seems more concerned with projecting strength
Yeah.
than dealing with the complexities of these situations.
It's a lot to process.
It is. Where do we go from here?
That's $1 million question, isn't it?
Yeah.
I don't have all the answers,
Right.
but I think it starts with asking the right questions.
Okay.
What are the real motivations behind these actions? What are the potential consequences, both intended and unintended?
Right.
And most importantly, how do we hold our leaders accountable
Yeah.
for the decisions they make?
It's not just about holding leaders accountable.
Right.
It's also about being aware
Yeah.
and involved as citizens. We need to be critical of the information we're given.
Absolutely.
Question the narratives that are presented to us,
Right.
and demand better from those in power.
I completely agree. Complacency and apathy won't lead to progress.
No, they
We
won't.
need to actively participate in shaping the kind of world we want to live in.
All right, we've covered a lot of ground here,
We have.
and it's a lot to think about.
It is.
Do you have any final thoughts before we move on?
Just this.
Okay.
We live in a world that's more complex
Yeah.
and interconnected than ever before.
Right.
The decisions made by our leaders
Yeah.
have far-reaching consequences. And it's crucial that we engage with these issues
Right.
in a critical and thoughtful way.
Well said.
Yeah.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed
Oh, yeah.
by the constant flow of news and information,
It really is.
but we can't afford to just tune it all out.
No.
We need to stay informed, ask tough questions,
Right.
and demand better from those in power.
Absolutely. The future depends on it.
So we've delved into some of the challenges President Trump is facing
Yeah.
in the realm of international affairs. His unconventional style,
Right.
coupled with the complexities of the situations themselves, seems to be creating a perfect storm of uncertainty
Yeah.
and potential pitfalls.
Okay.
Let's shift gears now
All right.
and take a closer look at this incident you mentioned earlier.
Okay.
The attempted assassination of someone referred to as Putin's death squad chief.
Right. It does sound like something out of a spy novel.
It does sound like something out of a spy novel.
Yeah.
And it highlights another layer of complexity in these global power dynamics.
Yeah.
We tend to focus on the major players,
Right.
heads of state, the military movements,
Okay.
but there's a whole other world of intelligence operations,
Yeah.
covert actions,
Right.
and internal power struggles happening beneath the surface.
It's like there's a whole other game being played
Yeah.
that we don't even know about.
We're not even aware of it. What do we know about this assassination attempt?
Well, the details are still coming out.
Okay.
But it seems that a bomb was detonated
Yeah.
in a luxury apartment building in Moscow
Right.
targeting an individual named Surishin. He's been linked to some pretty shady activities, which is how he earned the nickname Death Squad Chief.
So not exactly a humanitarian worker then.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
And then this incident raises some interesting questions. Who was behind the attack?
Right.
Was it a rival faction within Russia, a foreign intelligence agency? And what does it say about the stability of Putin's regime if someone so close to him can be targeted in this way?
It suggests that there are a lot of internal tensions and potential for violence, even beyond the war in Ukraine.
Right.
It's a reminder that power is a precarious thing.
It is.
And even those at the very top can be vulnerable.
Exactly. And it emphasizes the point that even as we try to understand the bigger geopolitical landscape, we need to be aware of these smaller, often hidden power struggles that can have a huge impact.
Absolutely. So to bring it all back to you, the listener, what does this all mean?
That's a good question.
We've got Trump making these bold moves on the world stage, often with confusing and potentially dangerous outcomes. We've got a war raging on with no end in sight. And we've got these shadowy assassination attempts happening in the background.
It's a lot to take in.
It is.
And it can feel overwhelming.
It can. But that's exactly why it's so important to engage with these issues in a critical and thoughtful way. We can't just ignore it all or accept the narratives we're given without question. We need to ask tough questions, challenge assumptions, and demand accountability from our leaders.
And that's where a deep dive like this comes in, right?
Exactly.
We're here to sift through all the noise, connect the dots, and hopefully help you make sense of this complex world we live in.
That's the goal. Our goal isn't to give you easy answers or tell you what to think, but to give you the knowledge and tools to think for yourself.
Because at the end of the day, the world is what we make it.
Well said. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
But it feels like we're left with more questions than answers.
It does a bit.
Is Trump a brilliant strategist, or is he just stumbling from one crisis to the next? Is the war in Ukraine a tragic but necessary fight for freedom, or a proxy war driven by the interests of powerful nations? And what does the future hold for a world facing so much uncertainty?
Those are big questions. These are questions we each need to grapple with using the information we have and our critical thinking skills. There's no one right answer. But just engaging with these questions is what moves us forward.
Remember, knowledge is power.
Absolutely.
The more we understand about the forces shaping our world, the better equipped we are to navigate the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead.
Okay. So stay informed and stay engaged. The world needs you to actively participate.
Okay, let's take a moment to recap the key themes and questions we've explored in this deep dive.
Okay.
We started by examining Trump's unconventional approach to international affairs. Focusing on his proposal to own Gaza. This bold and some might say perplexing idea raised concerns about its feasibility, legality, and potential for escalating tensions in an already volatile region.
Absolutely. We then turned our attention to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, where Trump's pronouncements about Russia's imminent collapse and high casualty figures seem to clash with the reality on the ground. We talked about the dangers of believing one's own propaganda and the need for leaders to base their decisions on accurate assessments of the situation.
Okay. We also explored the ethical implications of providing continued military aid to Ukraine, raising questions about whether this assistance is truly helping the Ukrainian people, or just prolonging a conflict they can't win.
It's a tough question. And throughout our conversation, we've emphasized the importance of critical thinking, questioning assumptions, and getting different perspectives. It's easy to just accept the narratives that are presented to us.
It is.
But we need to dig deeper, consider the motivations of those in power, and demand transparency and accountability from our leaders.
Absolutely. This leads us to our final point of discussion. The attempted assassination of an individual known as Putin's death squad chief. This incident, while seemingly unrelated to the broader geopolitical issues we've discussed, serves as a reminder of the complex and often hidden power struggles that shape our world.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that even as we try to make sense of the big picture, we have to be aware of the undercurrents, the clandestine operations, and the individuals who can have a huge impact on events.
Absolutely. So we've looked at Trump's foreign policy moves, analyzed the complexities of the war in Ukraine, and talked about the world of international espionage.
Right.
These are complex and challenging issues.
They are.
And there aren't any easy answers.
No.
But by thinking about these topics carefully and critically, we can hopefully start to make sense of the chaos.
Right.
And work towards a more peaceful and just world.
That's the hope. As always, the journey towards understanding never really ends.
Yeah, it's ongoing.
We encourage you to keep exploring these issues, look for different perspectives, and engage in constructive dialogue.
Okay. And remember, the world is what we make it.
It is.
Let's choose to make it a good one.
I agree.
But before we wrap things up, there's one more thing we'd like to mention.
Right.
It's an issue that's been in the news a lot lately, and it's generated a lot of controversy.
Okay. What is it?
It seems like every time we turn around, there's another headline about President Trump and his struggles on the world stage.
Yeah, it's definitely been a turbulent time.
You know, with all these international challenges, it's like he's constantly facing one crisis after another. Let's take a step back for a second and think about the big picture.
All right.
We talked about Gaza, talked about Ukraine.
Right.
We even touched on the whole world of spies and secret operations.
Yeah, that's right.
And all of these situations, they kind of point to a recurring theme.
Okay. What's that?
The difficulty Trump seems to have in finding lasting solutions on the international stage.
That's a good point.
Like, no matter what he tries, it never seems to really work out.
Right.
Whether it's his proposal to own Gaza or his claims about the Russian economy collapsing or his efforts in Ukraine, there just seems to be this gap between what he says he wants to achieve and what actually happens.
It's like his goals and the reality on the ground don't match up.
Exactly. It's almost like he's trying to use his business tactics.
Oh, yeah.
You know, those hard-nosed negotiation skills in the world of international diplomacy.
Okay.
But it's just not that simple.
No, it's a different ballgame altogether.
Right.
The world of international relations is built on a whole different set of rules. You've got long-standing alliances, historical conflicts, cultural differences. It's not just about cutting deals. You have to understand the complexities and the nuances of each situation.
Absolutely. And we see this playing out in the situations we've discussed.
Right.
His Gaza proposal, while it might have been meant to shake things up and force some kind of breakthrough, it's been met with a lot of skepticism and worry.
I can see why.
It's hard to imagine how such a plan could actually work without making tensions worse and potentially leading to more conflict.
That's a real risk.
Yeah. And then there are his statements about Russia, you know, about their economy collapsing, the sanctions being so effective.
Yeah.
It seems like he's more focused on wishful thinking than on a realistic assessment of the situation.
It's like he wants to believe it so badly that he's ignoring the evidence to the contrary.
And as we talked about earlier, that can be really dangerous.
It can lead to some serious miscalculations.
Absolutely. And even in Ukraine, where there's a lot of support for the Ukrainian people, the question remains, is the U.S. really helping them achieve a lasting peace?
Right.
Or are we just dragging out a conflict that will ultimately cause more suffering?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is a tough one.
And there are strong arguments on both sides.
Yeah.
But what's clear is that Trump's approach hasn't led to a quick resolution.
No, it hasn't.
And the situation remains very unstable.
It does. So we're left with this sense of unease.
Yeah.
I understand that despite his efforts, or maybe because of his unique style, Trump's foreign policy is just not working.
It's a valid concern.
It is.
The world is full of challenges. And to navigate them effectively, you need a deep understanding of history, culture, and diplomacy. You can't just rely on simple solutions or ignore the complexities that can lead to unintended consequences and even more instability.
Absolutely. And this brings us back to why it's so important for citizens to be informed and engaged. We can't just sit back and expect our leaders to fix everything. We need to understand the issues. Think critically about the information we're given. and hold our elected officials accountable.
Exactly. The world is more interconnected than ever before.
It is.
And the decisions our leaders make
Have a huge impact on everyone.
Right.
So it's crucial that we participate in the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Challenge assumptions.
Yeah.
And advocate for policies that promote peace, justice, and a sustainable future.
I couldn't agree more.
All right, so that wraps up our deep dive into President Trump's tumultuous journey through international affairs.
Been a wild ride.
It has been.
Yeah.
We've seen how his unconventional style and bold pronouncements
Right.
haven't always led to the results he intended,
Okay.
leaving behind a lot of uncertainty and unanswered questions.
It's a complex situation for sure.
It is. We hope this discussion has given you some food for thought, encouraged you to think critically about these important issues. The world needs informed and engaged citizens.
Right. People who are willing to challenge the status quo and work towards a better future.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
As always, we appreciate you joining us on this journey.
Thanks for listening.
If you found this episode insightful,
Yeah.
be sure to subscribe to our podcast,
Okay.
which is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube.
Great.
We are here to make things clear.